Think philosophically. This lecture is going to try to cover and take a step back from the way we often think about arguments in debate. Too often in debate, we focus on particular things you can say in the debate round, and don't think about how we can actually think about these things effectively in the first place. We don't critically assess what it means to engage in thought that's careful and rigorous about arguments. So the goal in this lecture is to take that step back and really think about how really, really smart people think. Because if we can learn how to think like they do, we'll make better arguments in debate rounds. Or so we'll argue. What is your name?
Shrey Raju.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And where does it all begin? Well, what I want to contend is that philosophy begins in a state of wonder. This has been a thesis defended by a whole host of philosophers throughout the history of philosophy. Names?
Augustia.
Gotcha.
Sahil.
Sahil. So we still don't have Joanna?
Right here.
Ah, we do. All right, that's all of us. Begins in a state of wonder. So here's Plato in the Theaetetus. For wonder is the feeling of a philosopher, and philosophy begins in wonder. Or Aristotle, it is through wonder that humans now begin, and originally began to philosophize. Wonder in the first place is obvious perplexities, and then by gradual progression, raising questions about the greater matters too. Okay, but wonder is not a word we use all that often. So when I say philosophy begins in a state of wonder, what do I mean by that? Well, I think we can best illustrate this with an example. So suppose that you walk outside one day, you walk out your front door, you're like, whoa, all the grass is orange. That's so weird. Now, what would your reaction be? You'd be confused, but you wouldn't be confused, you want to know the answer, right? So if you first rush to the backyard and look at the back window and be like, oh, the grass is orange in the backyard too. And you're like, all right, well, maybe it's just all yours. Maybe it's something about a prank. So you go outside and you look up and down the street and you go like over here, and it's all green, orange there as well. And you want to know the answer. And then you go, oh man, I wonder if this is toxic. Is it even safe to go outside? But eventually curiosity would overcome you, because you just need to know. So you start Googling it, right? Or you ask someone, because you want to know, right? Because that's so strange. The grass, all of it is one color. So what does it mean to think philosophically? To think philosophically just means you walk outside every day and go, whoa! Why is the grass green? Again. It was green yesterday, and the day before that, and now again today? That's bizarre. Now, most of you are sitting here being like, Marshall, that's ridiculous. Right? It being green is not like being orange, because we know why it's green. Of course you know why it's green. Grass is green because, and you smugly think to yourself as a scientist, not a philosopher, grass is green because it utilizes chlorophyll in order to create a chemical reaction which allows it to photosynthesize. And chlorophyll is green because it reflects light of a certain wavelength, which then operates with the eye by affecting certain codes, which then get translated into neuroprocessors, which eventually get processed in the back of the brain to create visual imagery. But the thing is, that's not why you don't wonder why grass is green. If that's why you didn't wonder why grass is green, then most grown-ups around the world would still wonder why grass is green, because most grown-ups don't know the science. And more importantly, that's not a good enough explanation. And I can show you it's not a good enough explanation, because I know that all of you already know it's not a good enough explanation. Because most of you have been through middle school, and it's a universal question that all middle schoolers wonder to themselves at some point in middle school, and that's this question. I wonder if everyone else sees colors the same way I do. Maybe what I see as red, they see as blue, and what I see as blue, they see as red. Yes?
It's actually, well, it is a theory that has had some backing in some like philosophy sort of thing, but like they've actually been able to prove that everybody sees color the exact same way. And by that I mean they've proven that the cones interact in the exact same way in many different people's eyeballs, and they did studies like that were conducted, and so essentially that question has been answered already.
No, because all the cones tell you is that the same chemical process occurs. But that doesn't tell you that the mental image that those chemical processes represent is the same. Right? That's a totally separate question. Right? Imagine you have two different screens, right? And two different screens take the same electrical inputs. That wouldn't mean they project the same thing unless the two screens are identical. But we don't know how the mind works. None of us know how the mind works. Scientists have no idea how the mind works. Right? They know how the brain works, but the brain doesn't seem to be the same thing as the mind. So the vast majority of you, right, have absolutely no idea why you see the color green, but you don't wonder about it. But why don't you wonder about it? Because it's weird. And if it was orange, you'd wonder about it. So the reason you don't is because you've been lulled into a false sense of security. You've been tricked into thinking there's nothing remarkable, or nothing strange, or nothing that demands explanation. And the reason you think there's nothing so strange is because you've seen it this way over and over and over again. But of course, the fact you've seen it this way over and over and over again doesn't mean it's not weird. It just means you've been inoculated against the weirdness. Your curiosity has been deadened by mere repetition. So what philosophers try to do is re-inculcate that sense of wonder at the ordinary, to recognize that just because something's common doesn't mean it doesn't stand out and demand explanation. There's a quote in this regard that I find really, really powerful. Now, the mere repetition made the things to me rather more weird than more rational. It was as if having seen a curiously shaped nose in the street, and dismissed it as an accident, I had then seen 6 other noses of the same astonishing shape. I should have fancied for a moment that it must be some kind of local secret society. So one elephant having a trunk was odd, but all elephants having a trunk looked like a plot. I speak here only of an emotion at once stubborn and subtle. But the repetition in nature seemed sometimes to be an excited repetition, like that of an angry schoolmaster saying the same thing over and over again. The grass seemed signaling to me with all its fingers at once. The crowded stars seemed bent upon being understood. The sun would make me see him if he rose 1,000 times. The recurrence of the universe rose to the maddening rhythm of an incantation, and I began to see an idea. That idea is the idea that dominates and motivates philosophy. The idea that the ordinary demands exploration, demands investigation, demands wonder, demands curiosity. So how do we inculcate that sense of wonder? Well, first we need to understand what's so great about that. And this is a passage from Bertrand Russell's article, The Value of Philosophy, which I find very compelling. He says, thus, to sum up our discussion of the value of philosophy is to be studied not for the sake of any definite answers to its questions, since no definite answers can, as a rule, be known to be true, but rather for the sake of the questions themselves. Because these questions enlarge our conception of what is possible, enrich our intellectual imagination, and diminish the dogmatic assurance which closes the mind against speculation. But above all, because through the greatness of the universe which philosophy contemplates, the mind also is rendered great, and becomes capable of that union with the universe which constitutes its highest good. So what's the claim here? The claim is that by engaging in wonder, we break out of the dull monotony of everyday life, and we're able to actually see a larger intellectual vista of the sort of universe we could be a part of. Because we don't set standards for what the universe amounts to just because of what we find ordinary or commonsensical. Common sense, I really believe, is in many ways the enemy of philosophical imagination and philosophical exploration. And I hope to demonstrate throughout the rest of this lecture how it is that we're going to inculcate this. And I want to start by looking at arguments. And the reason I want to talk about how to think philosophically about arguments is because arguments are the building blocks of a debate round. Arguments are essential to what we do. We spend most of our time researching arguments, finding arguments, developing arguments, responding to arguments, questioning arguments, comparing arguments, weighing arguments, crystallizing arguments. Basically every single thing that's done in a debate round can be articulated in terms of arguments. What are you flowing? Arguments. What are you responding to? Arguments. What are you developing? Arguments. What are you researching? Arguments. It's all about arguments. So, here's how I hope to motivate you all to care about this. We're going to learn to think about arguments. Now, the first thing that I think that the philosopher realizes about thinking about arguments is that arguments are not isolated. Arguments are not narrow things you can understand in their own right. Instead, they're part of much broader and more systematic organic unities. This claim was famously made by Hegel. And while I disagree with some of what Hegel understands this claim to mean, I think the image he used presented is rather beautiful. So, this is what Hegel says. The more conventional opinion gets fixated on the antithesis of truth or falsity, the more it's obsessed with what's true, what's false, and that's it. The more it tends to expect a given philosophical system to either be accepted or contradicted, and hence it finds only acceptance or rejection. It does not comprehend the diversity of philosophical systems as the progressive unfolding of truth, but rather sees in it simple disagreements. The bud disappears in the bursting forth of the blossom, and one might say the former is defeated by the latter. Similarly, when the fruit appears, the blossom is shown up in its turn as a false manifestation of the plant, and the fruit now merges the truth of it instead. These forms are not just distinguished from one another, they also supplant one another as mutually incompatible. Yet at the same time, their fluid nature makes them moments of organic unity, in which they not only do not conflict, but in which each is as necessary as the other, and its mutual necessity alone constitutes the life of the whole. So the claim here is that to understand an argument, you have to understand the context in which it's situated. If you try to understand Hobbesian political philosophy, you're going to be incredibly confused unless you understand the fact that Hobbesian political philosophy starts with an understanding of the human person in response to the teleological understanding of the human person that was manifest in Aristotelian science. So Hobbes is trying to take the critiques of Aristotelian science that was developed around this time period and similarly critique the assumptions of Aristotelian human nature in light of a denial of any sort of systematic teleology. And when you understand that, suddenly what Hobbes is doing in his political philosophy makes a whole lot more sense. Similarly, you understand Hobbes better if you understand the historical context in which he's writing. If you understand his notion of the state of nature as reflecting the kind of civil war that England was engaged in at the time of his writing, or before he was writing. You will understand philosophical ideas more clearly by understanding the views they're responding to. Here might be the best way to put it. If I were to give you a key, you could study that key. And you could understand all the intricate facets of that key. You could know perfectly how the ridges on the key go up and down. You could know the exact weight of the key. You could study the metal of the key and know exactly what it's made of. But if you had never seen a lock, if you had no idea what a lock is, you would not understand the key. You could know all sorts of things about it. Its weight, its color, its material, its size, its shape. You can know all of these details, but you wouldn't understand it. Because understanding the key depends on understanding a lock, because they're part of an organic unity. And so too, if you want to understand a philosophical position, you need to understand the philosophical position it's responding to, and how it differs from others in this history, and how it's been brought about as a stage in development. Now, certainly philosophers care about getting the right answer. But if all you try to figure out is this position true and don't try to understand other false positions as well, you're not going to be able to have the deep philosophical understanding that you're going to need. Now, how are we supposed to inculcate this? Well, my first suggestion is that it's really important to read old books. I highly recommend, if you want to think philosophically, delving into the history of philosophy, reading people like Plato and Aristotle, Thomas Hobbes, Immanuel Kant, Thomas Aquinas, Avicenna, Averroes. These philosophers have shaped the modern conversation in a way that's necessary to understand the modern conversation. This illustration, I think, is clever. If you join an 11 o'clock conversation, which began at 8, you will often not see the real bearing of what is said. When one could seem to you very ordinary and produce laughter or irritation, you will not see why. The reason, of course, being that the earliest stages of the conversation have given them a special point. In the same way, sentences in a modern book, which look quite ordinary, may be directed at some other book, in a way that would lead you to accept, in this way you may be led to accept what you would have indignantly rejected if you knew its real significance. Such a standing can be acquired only from the old books. It is a good rule after reading a new book never to allow yourself another new one until you read an old one in between. If you want to understand contemporary philosophical traditions, you need to understand the way they've developed, the way they have a history, the way that these assumptions that philosophers have are not free-floating. They're not something we just come up with if we started over. There's an example I like for this. John Rawls has a famous thought experiment in which he suggests that in order to really justify a political system, we should have to put ourselves behind the veil of ignorance, in which we forget all the particular parts of our identity and derive the principles of morality and justice from that. And then once we derive these principles of justice, we then figure out what sort of democracy we end up with. And so here Rawls goes behind the veil of ignorance, he forgets all of this history, and he comes out with a constitutional democracy, or sort of liberal constitutional democracy. A Massachusetts college professor ends up with a liberal constitutional democracy after questioning all of his foundational assumptions and building up from the ground up. But no, he doesn't. And Rawls doesn't think he's done this. Right? Rawls recognizes that he's operating within a particular socioeconomic point in history which shapes how he thinks about these things. But if you don't understand the way Kant's ideas have developed out of the Kantian traditions in which he's responding, if you don't understand the way they've been shaped by his understanding of social contract traditions, shaped by his understanding of Aristotle, then you're not going to understand Rawlsian philosophy. The next implication this has is that if it's true that we have to understand things as organic unities, then we need to wrestle with a deeply troubling philosophical problem. And this is the problem of the hermeneutic circle. The hermeneutic circle is the fact that to understand something, you have to understand the thing of which it's a part, but your understanding of that whole is in turn shaped by understanding the individual parts. So let's take a simple example. Suppose I'm at home, right? I'm visiting my parents, and my mom says, "Hey Marshall, can you come over here for a minute?" My reaction is like, uh-oh, what did I do this time? What do I have to do? And I'm nervous. Because my mom says that, it means I did something wrong, right? I need to fix it. In contrast, if I'm at home and my friend says, "Hey Marshall, can you come over here for a second?" I'm like, "Sure, what's up?" Right? Because my friend says that, it means something very different than my mom says that. I interpret the exact same sentence differently depending on who says it. Why?
Your understanding of them is different?
Yeah, my understanding of my mom is different, and my understanding of my relationship to my mom is different than my understanding of my relationship to my friend. So I change how I understand the whole of that thing by the point. But, okay, so I understand that particular interaction in light of my understanding of the whole. But where did I get my understanding of my mom from?
Your experiences in your life?
Yeah. In particular, all the particular interactions I had. I understand each particular interaction by understanding the whole of my relationship. But I understand the whole of my relationship through my understanding of each of the particular interactions. The whole is built up out of the parts, but the parts in turn are interpreted in light of the whole. And this results in a constant feedback mechanism in my ability to understand. So I might at first think, oh man, you misinterpreted what my friend said. I know that what he said sounded mean, but you just don't know him as well as I do. So here I'm saying you don't have the right understanding of the whole of him. But then it gets something else and I'm like, oh man, maybe he's a little meaner than I thought. And if that's true, then those other things that I thought were just him being sort of oblivious, maybe they were mean as well. Oh man, maybe he really isn't as kind of us as I thought. But if that's right, that time he spent that whole afternoon with me in the hospital, that wasn't just natural kindness. He must really have been worried about me. And there's a sort of constant give and take, where each change in understanding of who my friend is gives a slightly different cast from my understanding of all the individual interactions I've had, which in turn changes my understanding of the whole, which in turn changes my understanding of the parts, which in turn changes my understanding of the whole. And backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. Now, what practical implications does this have? Well, the first and most fundamental practical implication is this. You cannot read a philosophy article one time. It doesn't work. You won't understand it. Philosophy can't be understood with a single read-through. And the reason for that is because to understand the individual arguments in a philosophy paper, you need to have a sense of what the whole paper is doing. But you only get that sense of what the whole paper is doing by reading the individual parts of the article. A great example of this is in my introduction to philosophy class in undergraduate, I had a professor, Marshall Thompson, and he taught Plato's Republic in his introduction to philosophy class. He must have taught it at least 60 times, because he taught it, twice a year at least, every semester. Actually, he taught twice a year, every year for like 30 years that he'd been teaching intro to philosophy. But even when we were reading it, he was finding new stuff that he'd missed in previous reads. Particularly, I remember one time he totally changed his understanding of something that was going on in book 2 because he realized it was actually preparatory for what happens in book 5. And he updated this because he changed how he understood book 5 the previous time he read it. Now here's the thing. He was a brilliant reader. He was incredibly careful. He was incredibly clever. He had a remarkable understanding of that book. But even he was updating his understanding. Because as you understand the whole, it changes how you understand the parts. You are not nearly as good an academic scholar as Mark Talbot was. And so just as he has to read things over and over again to understand them, you need to read them over and over again to understand them. My recommendation when you're reading philosophy is that if you are quoting anything philosophical, you need to have read the piece at least twice. And if you're using it for like a case, you need to be reading it at least 3 times. And I mean at least. If you only read it 3 times, you better have read it really carefully and really slowly. Because philosophy is difficult. Philosophy is hard. Philosophers are not good writers. Philosophers are not always clear. And philosophers are often dealing with difficult concepts that are supposed to challenge your assumptions and challenge how you normally think about things. Which means when you just go in thinking about things in ordinary ways, you tend to misinterpret them. And so it's incredibly important that you slow down and read and reread and reread again. That's what it takes if you really want to get philosophy. If you really want to start understanding what you're reading. Because philosophy is confusing. It's so confusing. I've been doing this for years and years and years, and I'm so confused. Constantly. And if you're reading philosophy and you're not confused, you're not reading it carefully enough. So that's the first piece of advice. You have to read multiple times. But the second practical thing this means is that you need to figure out what your own assumptions about a text are. This is one of my favorite excerpts from this book by Hans Gadamer called Truth and Method. And he's dealing with the problem of the hermeneutic circle. And he says, a person trying to understand something will not resign himself from the start to rely on his own accidental foremeanings, ignoring as consistently and stubbornly as possible the actual meanings of the text until the latter becomes so persistently audible that it breaks through what the interpreter imagines it to be. Alright, that's a confusing sentence. Let's break it down. A person trying to understand something, so you're reading a text, you're reading a book, a reading text, a piece of philosophy. You won't resign yourself from the start to relying on your own accidental foremeanings. In other words, you won't just go in with an assumption. So suppose you want to read an article by Immanuel Kant, or a book by Immanuel Kant. Chances are you have some sense of what you think Kant says. You've heard other debaters talking about it, or you saw someone debate it in a debate round, or you heard a topic analysis where it was mentioned, or you saw a demo debate in which I tried to argue for a Kantian position or something. You have some assumptions about what Kant says. This is going to shape how you understand the thing you're going to read. You're going to go in with assumptions. You're going to think certain things will be said. And then, guess what? You'll find those things in the text. Because people are extraordinarily good at reading what they expect into a text. They're incredibly good at finding their own expectations confirmed even when the text isn't saying what they think it says. So if you just go in assuming these sort of assumptions and not realizing it, then the only way to break it out is when the inconsistency becomes so persistently audible that it breaks through what the interpreter imagines to be. Like, all right, this is, blah. You're just like so confused. You're like, okay, I must have misunderstood something. But that's not great. You don't want that to have to happen. So what does Godwin suggest? Rather, a person trying to understand a text is prepared for it to tell him something. That is why a hermeneutically trained consciousness must be from the start sensitive to the text alterity, sensitive to the fact that the text is doing something different than what you expect, recognizing that this is not going to just confirm what you think it's going to say. But this kind of sensitivity involves neither neutrality with respect to content. You can't read without any assumptions. Why? Because your understanding of the parts depends on an understanding of the whole. There is no interpretation of the parts without an interpretation of the whole, without an assumption about what the whole is doing. So you can't be neutral. So you can't be neutral with regards to it, nor to the extinction of oneself, because that's impossible, but to the foregrounding and appropriation of one's own foremeanings and prejudices. What does a foregrounding mean? It means you have to recognize for yourself what the assumptions of this text, what you assume this text is going to say. When I meet a philosopher for the very first time, someone I've heard a lot about but haven't really studied before, I'll often take a sheet of paper or open my computer document and just write down everything I think this philosopher thinks. Try to write down all the assumptions I have about what this philosopher says. And the reason I do that is because then I know to be cautious and be like, Marshall, be careful, because these are the things you're going to read into this book, even if it's not actually there. And so by first making clear what your assumptions about this are going to be, and they can be negative assumptions, they can be this philosopher thinks this, they can be this philosopher is going to make this mistake, this philosopher is not going to get this philosopher is going to be incredibly hard to follow, whatever it is, you write down everything you expect you're going to find in this text. Because in foregrounding your own prejudices, it's much easier to become aware of them. So then Gadamer says the important thing is to be aware of one's own bias, because the text can present itself in all of its otherness, and thus assert its own truth against one's own foremeanings. Because you can't read it without bias, you can't read it without assumptions. And so you have to become aware of those assumptions, and the way you become aware of those assumptions is by actively seeking out that awareness. But here's the thing. It's often difficult to find all the assumptions you're going to make. And that's because there's often this sort of general consensus in the community you're a part of. So we had to break out of that. We had to find a way to identify our own prejudices, our own assumptions. And lo and behold, Marshall Thompson will once again say the way to do this is to read old books. If you spend any time with me, you will very quickly realize that I'm going to take every opportunity I can to tell you to read Plato, tell you to read Aristotle, tell you to read the Upanishads, to tell you to read Avicenna, to tell you to read Aquinas, to tell you to read...
You're forgetting Socrates.
I can't read Socrates.
Why not?
Because he didn't write anything down.
Well, I guess you're only reading his ideas and stuff.
Right, the past
He
100
didn't write anything down. Good. There's nothing to read by Socrates. Alright, so here's the honorable book. Here's the second point. And note, we're going to broaden this in a second. Every age has its own outlook. It is especially good at seeing certain truths, and especially liable to make certain mistakes. Nothing strikes me more when I read the controversies of past ages than the fact that both sides were usually assuming without question a good deal which we should now absolutely deny. They thought they were as completely opposed as two sides could be, but in fact they were all the time secretly united by a great mass of common assumptions. We may be sure that the characteristic blindness of the 20th century, the blindness about which posterity will ask, but how could they have thought that? Lies where we never suspected it, and concerns something about which there was untroubled agreement between Hitler and President Roosevelt, or between Wilderson and Korsgaard. None of us can fully escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it and weaken our guard against it if we read only modern books. Where they are true, they will give us truths which we half knew already. Where they are false, they will aggravate the errors which we are already dangerously ill. The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, and this can be done only by reading old books. Now, Lewis is exaggerating a little bit. It's not that only old books can do it. There's two other things that can do it. First, books in the future. I've been looking for some, but I just can't find them anywhere. But books written like 200 years in the future, that will also do. But also, books written from totally different cultural contexts than you. Incredibly valuable. So, in particular, books outside of the sort of Western philosophical milieu is incredibly important. Reading poetry, reading literature, reading books of Asian philosophy, reading books of Indian philosophy. this is a great way to become aware of your own assumptions about what philosophy looks like. And even if you end up agreeing with your own assumptions, the point is you now recognize them as assumptions, rather than not even seeing that they are assumptions at all. And that's the terrifying thing. It's not that you should not have assumptions, you should not believe the foundations of what you do. Right? I really do believe that Western philosophy, in a lot of ways, is the best philosophical tradition, the clearest philosophical tradition. In a lot of ways, I think this. But I also try my best to read an awful lot of philosophy outside that tradition so I can realize which assumptions I'm just having because that's what I'm a part of. And even if I think those assumptions are correct, I want to know them as assumptions, and not just to have the assumptions without realizing them. So it's important to read outside of your comfort zone. In debate, this means, especially I think it's important to read like conservative perspectives on things. Because debate as a community has an awful lot of its own sort of echo chambers, which prevent you from seeing the way certain assumptions operate within one's own mind. One beautiful example of doing this is when I was reading the Upanishads, and I found this incredibly remarkable description of what philosophical exploration looks like. So I want to tell this brief story. I'm going to skip along parts of it because it gets kind of long, but we're going to go through parts of it. So it starts with Prajapati telling a story, or telling a sort of philosophical truth to the gods and the demons. The self that is free from evils, free from old age and death, free from sorrow, free from hunger and thirst, the self whose desires and intentions are real, that is the self that you should try to discover. That is the self that you should seek to perceive. When someone discovers that self and perceives it, he obtains all the worlds and all his desires are fulfilled. Now, the gods and demons became aware of this, like, oh man, that sounds really good to know. We should go talk to Prajapati and figure this out. And so, Indra sent out from the gods, and Rakana set up among the demons, and they each arrived at Prajapati carrying firewood. And Prajapati is like, okay, I'll tell you, but first you have to work for me for like 24 years or something ridiculous. Right? Spend like a bunch of time working for me, and then I'll tell you. And eventually after that, he tells them, adorn yourselves beautifully, dress well and spruce yourselves up, and then look into a pan of water. So they adorn themselves beautifully, dress well and spruce themselves up, and looked into a pan of water. And Prajapati asked them, what do you see? And they said, oh look, we're dressed up, we're spruced up, that's what we look like. And Prajapati's like, that is the self, that is the immortal, that is the one free from fear, that is Brahma. And the two of them left, aha, we figured it out. And so they went back to the gods and demons. And as they leave, Prajapati says, there they go without learning about the self, without discovering the self. The sign that will hold to this correspondence, whether it is the gods, the demons, is bound to be vanquished. And Rakana just goes back and doesn't come. But Indra, as he's thinking it through, is like, wait a minute, that can't be right. And eventually comes back. And Prajapati's like, wait, why are you back? And Indra says, if this is the self, then just it becomes beautiful when the body's beautiful, and well-dressed when I'm dressed up. So it becomes ugly when I become ugly, or crippled when I become crippled. What's the other thing that says? Blind when I become blind. And so this can't be that sort of immortal self that you identify. And Prajapati's like, yeah, that's exactly right. So stay here for another 32 years, and then I'll tell you the real answer. And Prajapati says this new answer. And the new answer is something like, you're the self that you are when you're dreaming, which you can sort of fully control. And then Prajapati's like, okay, that sounds good, and leaves and thinks about it. Indra's like, okay, cool, leaves and thinks about it. Like, wait, that can't be right. He comes back and is like, I can't be the one I am when I'm dreaming, because the one that's dreaming isn't, it's something I'm perceiving myself as, right? But I myself am the dreamer. I'm not the thing dreamt. And since I can dream in different ways, I can't change that way, and so that can't be right. And so Indra's like, you're right. Or Prajapati's like, you're right. Stay here for another, I think it's like 18 years this time, right? And I'll tell you the real answer. Another 18 years, and this time Prajapati's like, actually, it's the self you're on the dreamless sleep. Because you're right, it can't be anything you perceive, and so it has to be the thing without any perception. And it's like, oh, that makes sense. And then comes like, wait a minute. That doesn't work either, because that thing just doesn't exist at all. There's just nothing there. And Prajapati's like, good point. Stay here for another 20 years, and then I'll tell you the true answer. And eventually, at the end, Prajapati then says, now, when this sight here gazes into space, that is the seeing person. The faculty of sight enables one to see. The one who's aware, let me smell this, that is the self, the faculty of smell enables him to smell. The one who's aware, let me say this, that is the faculty of speech enables him to speak. The one who's aware, let me listen to this, that is the self, the faculty of hearing enables him to hear. The one who's aware, let me think about this, that is the self. The mind is the divine faculty of sight. This very self rejoices and perceives with his mind, with that divine sight. These objects of desire are found in the world of Brahman. definition, right, the self is that thing which perceives, which you can only sort of get at a glimpse. Right, so you can kind of look at the self only when you sort of catch yourself looking at something else. Right, so you're the thing that's seeing the laptop, and you can only sort of see the self kind of sideways along. Right, you can sort of become aware of yourself seeing something, because you're the thing seeing, not the thing that's seen. And so anytime you actually are thinking about the self, you're actually thinking about the thing thought, not the thing thinking, and so it's not really yourself. Now, this is an interesting philosophical position, right? It's worth discussing, but that's not the point of this talk. Because the point of this talk is not what is the true nature of the self, which I'm happy to talk about later, but instead, what is the method by which we investigate this? And I think what this story does a particularly good job of illustrating is that the process to understand this view couldn't be done by just giving the answer outright. Pajabati wants them to be able to know the truth, but recognizes that if you just say this at the outset, it won't make any sense. It's by going through the process and first realizing that, wait a minute, it can't be the thing I see in a pail of water. And it can't be the thing I see in the dreamless, right? Why? Because that thing is not under my control. And it can't be the thing when I'm dreaming, because even then it's the thing that I perceive and not the thing perceiving. And it can't be the mere mind when there's no thoughts at all, because when there's no perception, when I'm not seeing anything at all, there is no mind at work at all. And so instead it's eventually comes to the realization it's the mind that's doing the perceiving when you're perceiving. So not the mind with this dreamless state, but the mind that's seeing when you're out in the world. And what Indra had to do is each time live inside the philosophy. Accept it and try to see things from within that perspective. It's only from the inside of that worldview that you're able to actually assess how plausible it is. And I think this is a really, really important point to realize. And that's that an awful lot of philosophical discussions tend to stalemate. When I have philosophical arguments with people, often I just reject their first premises and they just reject my first premises. In other words, we both have a perspective on the world which seems coherent to us, but neither of us can point out any problem the other person would recognize as a problem. I can be like, your view has all these bizarre implications. And like, well, yeah, those are just the obvious implications. Right? And I'm like, I don't know how to talk to you anymore. There's lots of examples of this, right? So a very simple example, I'm a strict deontologist. I think there's certain things one can never do, no matter how horrible the consequences would be. And I'll talk to some utilitarians. And I'll be like, are you telling me that you would be okay torturing someone in order to stop two other people being tortured? Like, of course. I'm just like, what? How is that possible? Because from within my perspective, that's bizarre, but from their perspective, it makes perfect sense. But this makes it really, really difficult to understand things philosophically. And what this suggests is that sometimes the only way to really understand why one view is correct is to really live inside the view that's incorrect, to really try to adopt it and see things coherently within that perspective. Often what I'll do when I'm trying to understand a particular philosophical tradition or a particular philosophical view is try to sort of practically adopt it for a while. In other words, when I'm writing philosophy papers or reading other philosophy articles, I'll try to think, if I held this other view, how would I criticize this? What would be my response? I try to think about the world as I would think about it if I held these alternative views. And using that tool, trying to figure out what it's really like from the inside. Because that's the way where you really understand where the problems arise and where the real points of friction are. And that's how you really begin to develop a clear philosophical ability to understand the positions you're engaging with. Alright. So I made this claim that we need this wide view of arguments. But what I would suggest is that there's an important moral lesson which generalizes to an epistemic lesson. This is a particularly famous passage from Christian scriptures. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Now, I like this quote because it's just a true claim about morality. Right? Wide is the gate, and broad the road that leads to destruction. The person who just does whatever they want. The person who eats whatever they want. Right? Ultimately becomes very sick. The person who just spends all their time doing whatever they want ultimately can't hold down a job, can't get into a school they want to, isn't able to live the life that they want to live. In contrast, the person who's really disciplined, who practices a musical instrument 2 hours every single day, even when they don't want to, is the person who enters into a life of far greater musical opportunities. The person who's really, really strict with what they eat and really, really strict with working out every day is the person who's opened up to an old life where they can be much more fit, right, and have a lot more opportunities open to them. Right? Narrow is the road that leads to a sort of broadness. And this is the important thing to realize here. The word here for destruction is really like a word for crushing narrowness. And the word for life is like an expansive openness. So what the claim is that narrow the road that leads to expansiveness, and expansive the road that leads to a crushing narrowness. Right? Imagine for a moment a fish who says to himself, no longer will I serve this tyranny of water. No longer will I accept the laws that nature has given me and live within the confines of this aquafarious solution. No, I shall assert my independence and live on dry land like all great thinking beasts. And so the fist launches itself out of the water and lands on the dock. And now what happens? It dies, right? Because you can't live a life where you just live free from restrictions. No, a good life is one lived within the restrictions proper to the sort of thing you are. But parents who just let the kids do anything result in spoiled kids who can't really enjoy anything. It's only by living within the proper confines that you're able to live a broad and expansive life. And this claim that I think is true of ethics, I think is also true of philosophical thinking. If you really want to get this wide and deep and wise understanding of the world, you're going to have to learn to think carefully and rigorously and precisely. And the first thing you're going to have to learn is to learn to think logically. Now, this isn't formal logic. Formal logic's cool, but I don't think you need to learn formal logic. That's not what I'm suggesting. If you want to, do it. Absolutely. Great. But what you do need to learn is two things. First, I think you need to learn the common logical fallacies, at least for debate purposes. There's a Wikipedia article. It's incredibly long. The list of common logical fallacies. Read it. Learn it. Practice it. Really great activity to do a debate with your team during the year is you all watch a 7-minute segment of cable news, and you see who could find the most fallacies. It's generally pretty fun. Right? And you really need to learn them all, right? Not just really learn it, study it, try to get it. I have some people who always come like, Marshall, ontological fallacy. I'm like, okay, explain the masked man fallacy to me. And I don't know. Really learn it. It's really helpful. The second thing that I really recommend is argument mapping. So there have been a lot of studies which indicate that argument mapping is an incredibly useful way to learn to develop critical thinking skills. It's a way to visually represent the parts of arguments and how they link together. There have been studies that have found that a single semester of argument mapping in college has critical thinking gains equal to an entire 4 years of philosophy undergrad. Well, really 7 semesters, so not quite 4 years, of a philosophy undergrad. That's an incredible improvement in critical thinking abilities. You need to learn to think rigorously and carefully. And a really great way to do that is argument mapping software. VBI actually has partnered out with a group who has developed argument mapping software, and we have a free class that anyone can use via our code to try it out over the summer if they want to. And it's just a class on argument mapping, and if you message me, I can get you that information. It's a really great resource if you want to learn how to really think carefully and precisely. Next thing that's important, if you want to learn this sort of precise mode of thinking, is philosophical experiments, thought experiments. Now, why thought experiments? Well, for this reason. Why do we do experiments in science? Suppose I want to know how potassium reacts when you put it in water. Can I just take a banana and, drop it in the sink? Yes? If I want to know how potassium reacts in water, I can just put a banana in the sink?
No.
No? Why not?
Because a banana contains other chemicals, not just potassium, so you're not only studying potassium.
Yeah, so if I want to know how potassium reacts with water, I can't just put a banana in water, even though bananas have potassium, because it's confounding variables. There's too many other things that get in the way. What I have to do is I have to get pure potassium and put it in perfectly distilled water. And then what happens?
What happens? Correctly take observations.
Boom! It explodes. It's kind of cool. No one know this? Yeah, potassium in water explodes.
So
Anyway.
sodium. Yeah.
Yeah, all these things explode. All right. Now, philosophical experiments try to do the same thing. So let's take one of my favorite examples. Suppose there were an experience machine that would give you any experience you desired. Don't write anything down at this point. Just pay attention. Suppose there's an experience machine that would give you any experience you desired. Super duper neuropsychologists could stimulate your brain so you would think and feel like you were writing a great novel, or making a friend, or read an interesting book. All the time you'd be floating in a tank with electrodes attached to your brain. Should you plug into this machine for life, pre-programming your life's experiences? If you're worried about missing out on desirable experiences, we can suppose that business enterprises have researched thoroughly the lives of many others. You can pick and choose from their large library, or smorgasbord of such experiences, selecting your life's experiences for, say, the next 2 years. After 2 years have passed, you'll have 10 minutes or 10 hours out of the tank to select experiences for your next 2 years. Of course, while in the tank, you won't know that you're in there at all. You'll think it's all actually happening. Others can also plug in to have the experience they want, so there's no need to stay unplugged to serve them. Ignore problems such as who will service the machines if everyone plugs in. question? So here's what I want to know. Raise your hand. I'm going to make everyone vote. You guys vote one or the other. Raise your hand if you would plug into the experience machine. Raise your hand if you would not plug into the experience machine. Alright. Someone who would not plug into the experience machine. Why not? It's like the perfect life. Give me a reason.
I just don't think it would be very meaningful.
What wouldn't be meaningful about it?
Well, because if you'd only had good experiences, well then you wouldn't know like the meaning of them. You
Ah.
need to experience others.
So you would need bad experiences to appreciate good experiences. So why not go into experience machine and pre-program in the exact right number of bad experiences? Because right now you're living like, what if you have no bad experiences in your life? That'll suck. If nothing ever bad happens, you won't be able to appreciate all the good things that happen in your life. But you can make sure enough bad things happen by going to the experience machine. So that's even better, because you can get the exact right ratio of good to bad experiences for maximum appreciation.
Well, I mean, sort of. I don't. Well, like think of it as like numbers, right?
Say it again?
Think of it like numbers or something. Like
Mhm.
when you get used to an experience, like when people say if you have only good experiences, you won't know what's bad. But the thing is, they're not. They don't all have the same amount of pleasure. Like we assign pleasure to a variable, let's say x. So in most cases in your life, you feel zero pleasure, just a state of neutrality. Well, you feel some one way or the other, but nothing major. So what constitutes is great pleasures, let's say 5, and what constitutes something painful is probably like -5. And -5 is what makes 5 great. But let's say it's always 5, then 5 is still average for you. So at one point when you experience 10, it'll still be great, and when you experience 0, it'll still be bad. So if you experience all good, you'll still experience good because some things will be greater good than others.
Okay. So anyone, is there another reason we would not plug into the experience machine? Does anyone have a different argument for why we should not plug in?
I mean, I went for the other side, but I kind of realized the argument of sort of like, of somewhat, like a YouTube sort of thing and how you want to make the world around you a better place, and you can't do that being plugged into a machine.
Yeah, but why do you need to make it better? Everyone else can have the perfect life. If you're a utilitarian, then just have everyone plug into the experience machine, and then everyone will have the perfect life. That's by far better than anything you could do by living outside.
That's why I voted for the other one, but that was an argument.
Yeah.
There's nothing perfect, like there's no such thing as a perfect life. So let's say I want to go to Chipotle and McDonald's at the same time. I cannot. It's physically impossible to duplicate me and retain the same information even if I'm in the thought experiment. Like I can't duplicate myself.
Okay, but can't it be better than your life? Like even if it's not perfect, it can still be really, really awesome.
True, but then it goes back to what you were saying about even if you do have a perfect life, you won't feel that you won't have like the pleasures that benefit out of it.
Then put in some pains.
But there'll always be greater amounts of good at certain times than others. You won't be experiencing the same amount of constant pleasure doing everything.
Okay.
Some things will be more pleasurable than others, so good will always exist.
Okay, so what's an argument for why we should not plug in? You have one?
You can't like make your own experiences. Like the experiences that you have are all someone else's experiences, or like you can't necessarily create your own experiences that other people don't have.
Right, but you think you create your own experiences. So what do you care about making your own experiences or thinking you made your own experiences? Surely thinking you made them. Were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say like, well, you get to pick your experiences on this machine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, for me personally, I don't think I'll make the right choices, like picking the choice like on the machine, rather than like, because like living it out like not in this machine, you have to think about things that are a real problem, like things that are always like a driving force for you to do something. Like let's say, in this machine I could like go to like a very expensive restaurant if I wanted to, but like that's something I could program. But if I was not in this machine, I'd have to like let's say get a job to earn money to then go to a very expensive restaurant. And like for me, that's what like is a driving force. It's just like the thought that like you have to do something, like the thought there's like always more to do. I don't know if that makes sense.
So why is that good, right? You can program that in if you want. You can program in that you have a job. Just way program that the job will actually be successful. So you'll still think there's all the risk. You go, oh man, will it work, will it work, will it work? But then you don't risk the chance that it all fails. So this way you can can just have that perfect you can live exactly like you want. Just guarantee you won't get cancer at the age of 20. Right now you might. You could just live like the exact life you're going to live basically, but avoid that bad thing. That seems better. What were you gonna say?
How are you supposed to plug in the infinite different experiences a person could have in real life? Because if you're physically plugging in these experiences, then you'd have to preempt experiences, and that way you wouldn't be plugging in experiences that you could have had in real life that might be beneficial but you don't know about.
Yeah, but there's all sorts of experiences in real life you won't be able to have. For instance, in this world, you can plug in and like live in the world of Harry Potter and learn to use magic and cast spells. That's an experience you'll never be able to get in real life. So if it's about getting experiences you won't otherwise get, you could get a far greater range of experiences this way. Alright, we're running out of time, so I'm going to make a point here. And anyone can talk about these more about Socrates' hours. But look, this is what this experiment is designed to do. There's lots of things that people think matter to them, like risk. Like, I really want, some people are like, I wouldn't plug in because I want there to be risk. But the question is, do you want there to be risk, or do you want there to be the experience of risk? Do you want to actually not know if you'll succeed, or do you want to think you don't know if you'll succeed or not while you're doing it? And this is a really interesting question. Do you want to have a meaningful life, or to think you're having a meaningful life? Do you want to struggle, or do you want to think you're struggling? For any of these questions, we can ask this. And in order to give a reason to not plug in the experience, you have to find something which we care about the thing and not the experience of that thing. I think there are good answers to this, right? I think most of us in relationships care about the relationship, not thinking we have the relationship. So, for example, my mom is very worried I'm never going to get married. I'm deeply concerned about this. So I would not be surprised, like, you could imagine her being like, all right, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to bribe someone. Right? Find a nice 28-year-old girl and be like, look, Marshall's not that physically fit. He's going to die of like a heart attack at the age of 50. I'll give you a bunch of money if you just like pretend to fall in love with him, marry him, let him have a happy life, and then once he dies, you can take all the money and do whatever you want. Right? It's like, deal. Alright? And so I meet this person, they seem great, we fall in love, or I fall in love, we get married, I think they love me, right? I live this awesome life, and I never find out that it was all a lie. Do we think that there's something like pitiable or disappointing in that life, something bad about that? I think so, because we don't want to think we're in a loving relationship, we want to be in a loving relationship. Or simply a parent doesn't want to think their kid is thriving, the parent wants their kid to thrive. If a parent could take a pill, it would mean that even though their kid's living a really bad life, the parent thinks it's great, you wouldn't take that pill. Because the parent wants their kid to be well off. They want their kid to be great. They don't want to just think their kid's great. So if you live in the experience routine, you might think you have a kid who's really, really successful, but you don't actually have a kid who's really successful. And so these thought experiments are a way to distill down to what the core idea is. They let you really narrow in, and that's why philosophers use thought experiments so much. They're an incredibly useful philosophical tool. Another useful tool is using small words. Philosophers are notorious for using extraordinarily elongated terminology in order to investigate the epistemological presuppositions that dominate the modern socioeconomic systems by which we interpolate our individualism in order to try to construct within ourselves a sociological history in which we blah, 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 and all these meaningless things. But the thing is, that gets in the way of clear thinking. I really like this quote. Scientific phrases are used like scientific wheels and piston rods to make swifter and smoother yet the paths of the comfortable. Long words go rattling by us like long railway trains. We know they're carrying thousands who are too tired or too indolent to walk and think for themselves. It is a good exercise to try for once in a way to express any opinion one holds in words of one syllable. If you say, the social utility of the indeterminate sentence is recognized by all criminologists as part of our sociological evolution towards a more humane and scientific view of punishment, you can go on talking like that for hours with hardly a movement of gray matter inside your skull. But if you begin, I wish Jones to go to jail, and Brown say when Jones should come out, you will discover with a thrill of horror that you're obliged to think. It's not the short words that are hard. It's not the long words that are hard. The short words are difficult. The short words force you to really understand what you're saying. Debaters are incredibly good at using big words like epistemology and ontology and metaphysics and practical reason and metaethics and all these things in order to just have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. When you force yourself to articulate these things clearly with short words, it's an incredibly valuable way to improve your own philosophical thinking. So those are all some useful tips to think about arguments. That was the majority of this lesson. But I also want to talk about how we think about worldviews. And the first thing to realize is that in order to think effectively about worldviews, it's important to learn how to ask questions. To learn how to really figure out what the implications of different views are. Famously, Plato, in his book Apology, has Socrates explain the value of Socrates' life. He says that Socrates claims that the gods sent me to Athens as a gadfly, to ask difficult questions, to, rattle them outside of their comfort and to realize and sort of spur them to greater philosophical reflection. And I think this picture of the Socratic question, the question as the gadfly that spurs us to philosophical exploration, is a really, really important one. So how do we learn to ask these philosophically limited questions? Well, here I think we need to return to the notion of wonder. Because I really do believe that if you want to ask good questions, you need to learn how to wonder. You need to learn how to be curious. You need to inculcate a sense of curiosity. Because the naturally curious person who just wants to know what's true is going to ask deeper, more probing questions than the person who's just trying to come up with something to win a debate around. The man who has no tincture for philosophy goes through life imprisoned in the prejudices derived from common sense, from the habitual beliefs of his age or his nation, and from the convictions which have grown up in his mind without the cooperation or consent of his deliberate reason. To such a man, the world tends to become definite, finite, obvious. Common objects rouse no questions, and unfamiliar possibilities are contemptuously rejected. As soon as we begin to philosophize on the contrary, we find, as we saw in our opening chapters, that even the most everyday things lead to problems to which only very incomplete answers can be given. Philosophy, though unable to tell us to a certainty the true answers to the doubts it raises, is able to judge many possibilities which enlarge our thoughts and free them from the tyranny of custom. Thus, while diminishing our feelings of certainty as to what things are, it greatly increases our knowledge as to what they may be. It removes the somewhat arrogant dogmatism of those who have never traveled into the region of liberating doubt, and keeps alive a sense of wonder by showing familiar things in unfamiliar aspect. This notion of the tyranny of custom, the tendency to just find things as ordinary and not rouse curiosity or questions, that's the danger of an unphilosophical way of thinking. That's the danger of an unwondrous approach to the world. And it's also a problem in debate. If you're not wondrous, you're not going to be asked to ask deep, interesting, philosophically probing questions. Instead, you'll ask questions that have some debate utility, but that aren't going to really help you to understand and to be convincing and to be persuasive. The greatest framework debaters who I've ever known have all been people who were really interested in philosophy for its own sake. And part of the reason for this is that philosophy can't be done for the sake of trying to win an argument. If you do, it just doesn't work. So this is again Russell. Philosophical contemplation does not, in its widest survey, divide the universe into two hostile camps, friends and foes, helpful and hostile, good and bad, af and neg, my opponent's view and my own. Rather, it views the whole impartially. Philosophical contemplation, when it's unalloyed, does not aim at proving the rest of the universe is akin to man. All acquisition of knowledge is an enlargement of the self. But this enlargement is best obtained when it is not directly sought. It is obtained when the desire for knowledge is alone operative, by studies not which in advance which its object should have this or that character, but adapts the self to the character which it finds in its object. The desire to prove this is a form of philosophical self-assertion, and like all self-assertion is an obstacle to the growth of the self which it desires, and which the self knows it is capable. Self-assertion and philosophical speculation, as elsewhere, views the world as a means to its own ends, and thus makes the world of less account than the self, and the self sets bounds on the greatness of its goods. In contemplation, on the contrary, we start from the not-self, and through its greatness the boundaries of the self are enlarged. Through the infinity of the universe, the mind which contemplates it achieves some share in infinity. So, if you want to take up gardening in order to relax, it'll work well if you really try to make a beautiful garden. But if with each dig of the spade you're thinking, alright, this won't be relaxing. No, that wasn't relaxing. Alright, this one I'm going to find relaxing. Alright, this one will be relaxing. Won't be relaxing. Or if you try to play a game of Risk to have fun, but don't try to win, it won't be that fun. Or if you try to make friends to deal with your loneliness, but don't come to care about your friend, instead just care about not being lonely, you won't actually make a friend, and so you won't eliminate the loneliness. In the same way, if you try to think philosophically, not because you're curious and want to know the truth, but just so that you can ask better debate arguments and win more debate rounds, you won't be able to think philosophically. It's not how the mind works. If you go in thinking, I'm going to come up with the argument for my position, then you're not going to ask the deep and probing questions that actually allow one to excel philosophically in their thoughts. And so, we need to find a way out of this. And there's two recommendations I have for how to inculcate the sense of wonder. The sense of wonder where you actually care about it for its own sake. First, there's something paradoxical about what's happening here. You all came likely to this talk so that you could get better at debate. Because you believe that thinking philosophically will help you win debate rounds, and it will. Right? The best philosophical debaters have been incredibly good at debate. Incredibly good at argument generation. But, I've now told you that if you want to do this, you have to do it for reasons other than trying to win debate rounds. Because you can't think philosophically just in order to win a debate round. So what do? Well, luckily, you're all interested in some philosophical question. Everyone in this room is interested in something philosophically. Maybe you want to know if God exists. Maybe you want to know if human beings have free will. Maybe you want to know what makes humans different from animals. Maybe you want to know if the obligations of the state different from the obligations of the people. Maybe you want to know if it's ethical to have children, or under what conditions it's ethical to have children. Maybe you're curious about how color works. Maybe you're curious about whether or not tables exist or they're just collections of atoms. Maybe you're curious about how individuals can jointly cooperate. Maybe you want to know about the nature of friendship. Maybe you want to know about the nature of love. I don't know. But there's something you find philosophically interesting. And there's been excellent philosophy done on that subject. I'm confident about it. And so what you do is you start with that question that you find interesting for its own sake. And then you'll find that to understand the answer to that question, you'll have to find answers to other questions. And so you read these other questions. And these other questions will lead you to other questions. And those other questions will lead you to other questions. And within 2 or 3 iterations, you'll find something debate applicable. I'm confident, because philosophy is so interconnected. So you will, by this process, come to things debate applicable, and now you'll come to do them for their own sake. You'll be curious about them for their own sake. You'll wonder about them for their own sake. And so you'll be able to engage with them philosophically. The last piece of advice I have is that if you want to inculcate a philosophical sense of wonder, you need to recognize there's a close connection between the philosophical sense of wonder and a childlike sense of wonder. So the philosopher who says, "Why is the grass green?" is just like the kid who says, "Why is the grass green?" And you give them an answer, "Why is that true? Why is that true? Why is that true? Why is that true? Why is that true?" Children are just philosophers. The annoying child who keeps asking why, is just a proto-philosopher. And what I want to contend is there's a close connection between between wonder, philosophical wonder, and a childlike sense of wonder. And this means that we need to inculcate certain childlike dispositions in ourselves. So I'm going to end with this quote. This elementary wonder, however, is not a mere fancy derived from the fairy tales. On the contrary, all the fire of the fairy tales is derived from this. This is proved by the fact that when we are very young children, we do not need fairy tales. We only need tales. Mere life is interesting enough. A child of 7 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door and saw a dragon. But a child of 3 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door. Boys like romantic tales, but babies like realistic tales, because they find them romantic. This proves that even nursery tales only echo an almost prenatal leap of interest and amazement. These tales say that apples were golden, only to refresh the forgotten moment when we found that they were green. They make rivers run with wine, only to make us remember, for one wild moment, that they run with water. I've said this is all wholly reasonable and even agnostic, and indeed on this point I'm all for the higher agnosticism. Its better name is ignorance. We've all read in scientific books, and indeed in all romances, the story of the man who has forgotten his name. This man can walk about the streets and can see and appreciate everything, only he can't remember who he is. Well, every man is the man in that story. Every man has forgotten who he is. One may understand the cosmos, but never the ego. The self is more distant than any star. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, but thou shalt not know thyself. We are all under the same mental calamity. We've all forgotten our names. We've all forgotten what we really are. All that we call common sense and rationality and practicality and positivism only mean that for certain dead levels of our life, we forget that we've forgotten. All that we call spirit and art and ecstasy only means that for one awful instant we remember that we forget. The philosophical impulse says, "Why do rivers run with water?" which is the same impulse of the fairy tale when it makes them run with wine. The philosophical question for wonder is to inculcate a childlike view of the world. And I think one of the best ways to inculcate this childlike view of the world is to inculcate a childlike sense of play. I like to carry around finger puppets with me when I do philosophy, because I find them a useful reminder of the fact that you can't take yourself too seriously. It's critically important to remember that the best philosophers are people who inculcate this childlike sense of wonder of the world and see the world as a strange and marvelous place. And we do that by being playful. We do that by being silly. We do that by not taking ourselves too seriously. And if you can do that, if you can avoid taking yourself too seriously and thinking that you know what you're talking about, that's what it takes to really learn to think philosophically. Thank you.